You're still muted. Do you know that?
Thank you. I'm so sorry. Discombobulated by the 5-year-old being homesick today. I'm so sorry. I'm here. Hello. I'll start over again. So welcome to the second part of Types of Forced Migration with UCC National Ministries. The purpose of this series is to help churches discern the difference between refugees, asylum seekers, humanitarian parolees, and other types of ways that you can host migrants and what all those terms mean. Because the US resettlement system and the international resettlement system is complicated, and these words may be difficult to understand or foreign, and that's okay. This is meant to help you figure out which one works best for you and your church, if any, to be able to host asylum seekers, refugees, and other types of migrants, which is our hope for a proposed outcome for this series, is that we get more churches that are hosting. So last week, the first week, we did an overview of the migration system. You can go back and watch that on YouTube. The link will be available through email, also through our e-news and UCC news. And that one is very information heavy, in which I went over the entirety of what the system looks like, why it looks that way. But a basic summary is that it's sort of a free-for-all, that there's not very many actual designated rules between countries over what an acceptable forced migrant looks like. The only designation is that they have to be fleeing certain types of persecution. And over the years, that has been bent and turned into securitization, where we just don't allow anyone into our borders. That's coupled with increased migration. We are now at the highest per capita ever of people that have been forcibly displaced from their homes worldwide, at 100 million and counting. That is a really unfortunate record number, which is another reason that we're doing this series, because the more folks that are forcibly displaced, the more churches need to step up and help. So I do appreciate you coming in to discern with us about whether or not that is a calling of your church. So today we're going to go over refugees. Refugees are the easiest population, and by easy I mean none of them are that easy, to host. And the reason why is, well, I'll just go into the PowerPoint. But of all the types of forced migration, refugees are the easiest to host, which is why we're starting there. Because if you've never hosted an immigrant family before, this may be a really good place to start, because you're going to get the most amount of support from social services, from the things that they are eligible for within the system. And we'll go over that just as soon as I can open up the While I'm finding it, if you can just drop where you're from, any information about if you are actively hosting a family, what kind of family it is, without any particulars about names, I would be happy to learn more about that. Okay, so here we are. I'm sorry, you're going to hear a little bit of my daughter playing a video game in the background. Is that too noisy? Are you guys having trouble hearing because of the video game noise? Okay, great.
It's fine.
Okay, so again, this part of the series is an overview of the refugee resettlement system, specifically in the United States, because that's where all of us are in the UCC, is the United States. So we'll just be covering about how refugees are resettled in our country. So this is an image from UNHCR about how the process happens of a person becoming a refugee. Again, it's the easiest type of migrant to host. And the reason why is because they go through all of this. So basically, they start with being an asylum seeker. Every refugee at one point was an asylum seeker. An asylum seeker is a person that arrives at a secondary country. They arrive usually at a neighboring country and say that their life is being threatened. They're going to die if they stay at their home. And they ask if they can come into the secondary country to seek refuge. So that's an asylum seeker. All refugees at one point are asylum seekers. Those asylum seekers are vetted over the course of years, processed, and then eventually they become a refugee, maybe. through this process. Only 1% of people that are forcibly displaced, so of 100 million people, that's about a million, become actual certified UNHCR refugees. So the way that it happens is they show up at that border, and then if UNHCR is at that border, which they are if there's a refugee crisis happening, UNHCR is active in countries such as Turkey and Poland, and in the Horn of Africa, other places where there's large amounts of refugee response needs. And so they process folks into the secondary country, make sure that they are immediately safe, register them into their system, and they provide things like refugee camps. That's where we see refugee camps pop up. Those usually aren't actually refugees living in those camps. They are asylum seekers. And again, the difference is a refugee is a person that's been processed all the way through, whereas an asylum seeker is a person at the beginning of the process. So they live in those camps. One of the biggest camps is Camp Zatari, which is in Jordan. And they can live there for years, anywhere between, we've seen refugees in the Horn of Africa that have lived in a refugee camp in a secondary country for up to 30 years. And they actually don't know any other way of life, these asylum seekers who are living in these camps. Kenya hosts a huge population of refugee camps. I actually think the largest refugee camp in the world is in Kenya. I'd have to double check that though. And the reason why is because Kenya kind of acts as a sort of Switzerland, in the way that it's a safe space for neighboring countries that are in conflict to go to. Jordan acts as that as well. Jordan is a relatively stable country in the midst of countries that are in conflict. So it tends to be that UNHCR will set up in a country that is relatively stable among other countries that aren't stable. So Kenya hosts asylum seekers from Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, and all of those countries. And we're probably going to see a large influx of people that have been processed from asylum into refugee status coming specifically out of the Horn of Africa because of the massive drought and conflict that is happening there currently. So the next refugee wave that we are probably going to see coming through the United States will not be Ukraine, it'll be the Horn of Africa. So I'm just giving you an example, is that there's a huge refugee camp in Kenya that hosts all these other asylum seekers from all these different countries. They live there for several years, and then they make sure that they're safe, and then they're assessed to see if they can go back home. That is the ultimate goal always, is for folks to go back home. Nobody wants to leave their country. No one wants to leave their culture. No one wants to leave their stuff behind, or their family, or their language, or everything that they've known. So the ultimate goal is always to send them back home if and where possible, which is why people stay in refugee camps for so long. They're waiting it out to see if it's ever possible to go back home, basically. If it's identified that this person is not eligible to ever go back home, and again, the process for deciding that assessment is kind of contrived, but UNHCR tries to standardize it into, will this person personally die, not just is the country exploding, is everything messed up there, but will this individual specifically die if they go back to their home country. And so if the answer is yes, according to UNHCR standards, this person will die if they go back to Eritrea, Somalia, Ethiopia, wherever it is that they're at. Hold on, I'm just going to do a couple muting in here. Then they're processed into being a formal refugee, which is a several-year process, because if you become a formal refugee, that means they're going to send you on to a third-party country. So again, I've been talking about secondary countries. Kenya is a huge secondary country for the Horn of Africa. Jordan is a huge secondary country for the Middle East. And those are basically the two biggest hubs for being secondary countries. But secondary country is basically any country in which someone flees as an asylum seeker over the border from their country in conflict. But UNHCR, once they decide this person will die going back home, they need to go to a third country. So this Eritrean who escaped Eritrea goes to Kenya, their secondary country. UNHCR determines that that person will personally die from if they go back to Eritrea. So they decide to send them somewhere else. So that somewhere else would be the third country. So they're going to send them to Germany, the UK, Australia, the United States. How do they decide which one of these countries they get to go to? Well, those countries all sort of argue about that. But basically, what they've determined is if they have friends or family that they can identify in one of those places, that's the best place for them to go because they already have a built in community, someone that can show them around, someone that can help resettle them in that place. So let's say that Layla we'll keep going with the Eritrea example. Layla from Eritrea has been in Kenya for 17 years. And finally, it's determined that her home tribe in Eritrea is under very specific threat of death and attack, and she can't go back there. So they ask Layla, do you have any friends that are in anywhere else in the world? And Layla will say, I have a cousin who lives in Minnesota. And so they will vet Layla's claim that she has a cousin there. They'll vet the cousin in Minnesota to make sure that cousin doesn't have 20 DUIs or something. And they'll vet everything in their entire family's life, everything that person has ever touched. And as you can imagine, that process takes a long time. So even though Layla's been in that camp for 17 years, it's still going to be a couple more years of processing before and make sure she has all of her shots, all of her shot records are up to date according to U.S. format. I was in Gettysburg visiting a collaborative there yesterday, and the Afghan family that they were hosting said that they were given their vaccinations 3 times entering the United States, just because the chaos of the situation made it so that they didn't have the shot records. So they got vaccinated for COVID, measles, other things 3 times in a row by 3 different governmental agencies. Because usually this is a lot more streamlined. Anyway, Layla has to get all this stuff done before she's allowed to go to Minnesota. So it's finally determined that her cousin in Minnesota doesn't have 20 DUIs. Layla isn't a security threat. Layla has all of her vaccinations. She has all her documents together. She's been vetted to make sure that she absolutely cannot go back to Eritrea. And then she gets to go on a plane to the United States. On the receiving end, the refugee office in Minnesota will probably get a week to a month's notice that Layla is coming. And maybe Layla has 7 to 10 kids. Maybe Layla has a husband. And so they get a notice from the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which receives them on the domestic side from UNHCR. UNHCR does the international stuff. And then when they come to the United States, the Office of Refugee Resettlement is the domestic part of the refugee system. They put a notice into Minnesota. We are resettling Layla and her family of 9 in this area because cousin Mohammed's here and he's going to be the receiver that's going to come take care of her. And you're going to process her. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement hands a check amount of money to that refugee office in cousin Mohammed's neighborhood in Minnesota and says, this is her resettlement money. This is meant to pay rent for her for a couple months and get her on her feet. And this is your jurisdiction. So the refugee office coordinates with cousin Mohammed, and they go pick up Layla at the airport. They've hopefully secured housing for her by now. Usually refugee offices have a certain amount of landlords that they work with so that they can get someone housed quickly in a month's notice. And then they go find furniture, usually from a church or some sort of stock supply or a social services organization that they use. And then they get Layla quickly into that apartment. And the very first thing they do in the first week that Layla's going to be in the United States is they're going to bring her to the Social Security office. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. But I'll make this image available to you too. This is basically a shorthand explanation of everything I just said. Is they go from being an asylum seeker to making sure they're stabilized in a secondary country, assessed if they need to go to the third country, and then they arrive in the third country. So country of conflict, secondary country, host country, third country, and that's where they become refugees, is in the third country. So I explained some of this a little bit. Let me get back to what happens to Layla once she reaches the United States, and I'll come back to this. So this is basically what I'm talking about right here. So the refugee office gets short notice that they're going to get Layla and her family, which is why if you go to a refugee office and you say, I specifically want a Ukrainian family, they are not probably going to receive that well because they don't know when they're going to receive a Ukrainian family. They just get sudden rosters of people that they're getting, and they don't want to have to keep in mind a church that has asked for a specific ethnicity of family. So if you discern that you would like to host a refugee family, my recommendation to you, you can ask for a certain ethnicity, but my recommendation is that you be discerning about whether or not you'd be willing to accept Layla from Eritrea, who doesn't speak any English and has lived in a refugee camp for 17 years. If that is an okay vision for what you would like to host, then that's probably the best way to be prepared. Is you don't know who you're going to get, you don't know where they're from, you don't know what the background is. The refugee office doesn't either. So Layla, cousin Mohammed, who's in Minnesota, and someone from the refugee office or a church person that has decided to host Layla, pick her up at the airport and take her to this house that has probably been secured through a network of landlords that the refugee office has. And Layla and her family go to sleep. Maybe they get a nice meal that someone donated. And then the next morning, their case manager from the refugee office picks them up and takes them to go apply for benefits, such as a Social Security card. The Social Security card gets them all the other stuff. Those usually come relatively quickly because the US government and the Office of Social Security understand that they can't get any of the other stuff without the initial Social Security number. So usually they get that between 1 to 3 weeks of arrival. And that opens them up to be able to get things like TANF, which is temporary assistance for needy families. It's a small amount of cash that they get every month for up to 5 years. RCA means it's a single adult without children. That's refugee cash assistance. And that means that they get 9 months of about $300, or it used to be, it's not that much, of some small amount of cash to help them initially get resettled. And that's only if they don't have kids. If they have kids, they get TANF. They also get SNAP, which is food stamps. All of them do, no matter what kind of refugee they are. And all of this is preempted by the fact that they have been processed in as a refugee over the course of all these years. They've already been vetted, and so it doesn't surprise the Social Security office when they come in and apply for these things. Now, it says, or match grant. So in order to avoid the government giving TANF or RCA, because the government likes its purse strings, right? They don't want to be funding a family of 9 on TANF for 5 years if they don't have to. There's a secondary option called match grant that refugee offices very commonly use. And that's if it's determined that this person that has come over is highly employable. For example, they have good English, they have a strong willingness and desire to work, they have excellent transferable work skills. They're put on something called match grant. And that means that they get a larger amount of cash that comes through a grant, a federally funded grant that is given to the refugee office. And that pays for the rent, that pays for everything. But the catch is that they have to accept the very first job that they're offered. So if Layla has good English and she says she wants to work and she doesn't have visible trauma that needs to be worked through first, which often happens, the case manager says, "Are you willing to go work at a hotel?" Layla says yes. And then she might put her on, the case manager might put Layla on match grant. And match grant pays for everything in Layla's life as long as she takes that first job. And the idea is that Layla will be self-sustainable quicker by being willing to just jump right into the system and avoid taking government funding. So a lot of refugees go on to match grant as opposed to TANF. So those are the 2 ways that they get funded when they initially come to the United States. The refugee office also assists with employment because, again, the whole goal is to get them a job so they can sustain themselves. That is the whole goal, is for them to pay their own rent, pay their own bills, boom, 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 which has become increasingly harder with inflation and the extreme rise of housing costs, which has changed a lot about the way refugee resettlement works. Because often, going back a little bit, cousin Mohammed was probably resettled in, what's a major city in Minnesota? Anybody? Milwaukee? No, that's Wisconsin. St. Paul? Is that a city in Minnesota? Yeah. So let's say that cousin Mohammed was resettled in St. Paul. I hope that's the right city. I'm sorry if I botched that. And St. Paul has gotten too expensive for refugees to live in, but there's already a sizable refugee population there, which is why Layla was sent there, is because she has a refugee community she can live with. However, Layla can't afford the rent in St. Paul, Minnesota, because she works at a hotel. This has become an increasing problem recently in refugee resettlement, which may be one reason why there's been massive changes in the way the system works specifically this year, and I'll get to that. So the expectation is that Layla pays her own rent, she figures everything out for herself, and she is self-sustainable by 6 months maximum. And that's all a refugee office does. That's all that they are contracted to do by the US government. Pick them up, find them a house, find them a job, make sure they have the right benefits, maybe check in on them once in a while. But that's it. Other things that refugee offices do often offer based on grants that they are funded through, but they don't necessarily have to offer, include things like legal help adjusting their status, micro enterprise for them to open a business. We have a grant in the ECC to help refugees with that. ESL classes, citizenship, financial literacy, cultural integration, transportation, asylum processing. A lot of refugee offices won't even touch asylum seekers because they don't have all this necessary paperwork to get all this easy stuff. And it's not easy, that's the wrong word. To get all this easier stuff like TANF and SNAP and RCA and Social Security. A lot of refugee offices won't even talk to an asylum seeker, but some refugee offices have funding to help asylum seekers figure out how to get through the process. Not all of them. Career training, childcare, these are all icing on a cake. They're nice things that refugee offices may offer, but don't necessarily. So that's the way a refugee resettlement has always typically looked like in the United States. Like I said, this year kind of changed things with the Afghan crisis. A lot of things are different. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that places like St. Paul, Minnesota, and everywhere else, major metropolises where refugees are typically resettled, are no longer affordable for refugees to live in. So I'm going to go back here. The current refugee cap for the United States is set by the US president. President Biden has put that at 125,000 for this fiscal year. President Trump had it, I think, at 25,000 and didn't meet those numbers. The US president very rarely, if ever, does actually meet the numbers. Currently, we have about 25,000 resettled. The total for 2021 was 12,000. So they say there's a cap, but they almost never actually resettle that amount. Like I said, it's very hard to process into becoming a refugee. Only 1% of displaced people are refugees. Among maybe just security and racism reasons. I don't know all the reasons why we don't ever meet that number. It's an advocacy focus that we could work on for anyone who's called into advocacy. Most people that are formalized as refugees come from Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. Those are the most common types of refugees. Folks from Ukraine are not refugees. I mean, some of them are. Some of them have been processed. But right now, most of the folks that fled their country in February are asylum seekers in Poland. They have not been transitioned into the refugee resettlement system, which is why we're not seeing massive amounts of Ukrainians streaming to the United States right now, because they're probably going to be processed for years. And again, the hope is that they actually go home eventually. And if they are processed as refugees, a lot of them are going to have friends and family, a US tie, in Europe, not the United States. So that's the reason why we're not seeing massive numbers of Ukrainians. We will get an increase of Ukrainians in the United States probably in the next year or two, but not so substantial like it was in Afghanistan. Ways to sponsor a family. Most traditional has always been the local refugee office, which is what I just described. The local refugee office gets a referral from from Kenya about this Eritrean named Layla, who's fictional, because her cousin Muhammad lives there. That's the way it's always worked. And then they are centered into communities. Different refugee populations have different communities across the United States. Traditionally, folks from the Horn of Africa tend to be centralized. I use Minnesota as an example because a lot of them are up there in Minnesota, working at meatpacking plants in Minnesota and Wisconsin. That's a major resettlement hub for folks from the Horn of Africa, as well as North Carolina and the Northeast. That's where you see a lot of folks from the Horn of Africa. Afghanistan, it used to be that the central areas that Afghans went to were Sacramento, California, Seattle, Washington, Dallas, Houston, and Northern Virginia. Of course, with this crisis that just happened, they're everywhere now, but those were the centers for that ethnicity. Ukrainians are centralized in Cleveland, Chicago, New York, Detroit. That's where you see a lot of Ukrainian refugee populations. And they do this on purpose, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, so that communities can stay together. So you'll see more of an increase of Ukrainians in an office in Cleveland than you would in an office in Portland, Oregon. So that's also important to keep in mind, is what types of immigrant populations you have that are concentrated in your area. It's more likely, if you decide to host a refugee family, that you'll get more of that type of immigrant, because that's where their family already is. Of course, this year changed things because of the Afghan crisis. Very suddenly, 80,000 humanitarian parolees, which we'll cover next week, came over and are being processed as refugees, which has never happened before. Not like that. So the way that the US government responded to that, because local refugee offices could not handle the capacity, is they did something called the Sponsor Circle program, in which private citizens, private churches, groups of concerned citizens, such as veterans or Elks Lodges or whatever, universities could privately host a refugee family. And that means that they directly get the funding instead of a refugee office, and they have to figure out all the things that person would need. They are trained in it, but it's remote. And that's something you could do if you want to host a refugee family from wherever. And this is brand new, is the Sponsor Circle programs. You can sign up for Sponsor Circles, go through the trainings, meet the requirements, and then you are technically a refugee office, which is brand new. Church World Service has something similar, in which they also do remote resettlement for people that are in more rural areas. Private organizations like churches that are in rural areas that aren't close to a refugee office can go through Church World Service to do a very similar training to what Sponsor Circle offers. Church World Service is a official partner of the United Church of Christ. We work with them very closely. I trust them. If you want to do private sponsorship without the use of a refugee office, you can use Sponsor Circles to do that, but you cannot use Church World Service. Church World Service would prefer that you use your local refugee office to maintain good and healthy relationships with those refugee offices. So I can answer any questions that folks have about those 3 different designations. Again, 2 of them are brand new. It used to be just that the refugee office just puts out refugees and maybe a church works with them, and that's not the case anymore. The refugee office isn't technically needed at all to resettle a refugee family as of this year. So I went over this a little bit about what that looks like. And none of this sounds easy, but again, it's the easiest type of hosting of a migrant, because they get all of these amenities from being processed in a secondary country for years and years before coming here. So I've gone over this list before. This is just a list of things that a refugee family would need. And I went over that a little bit. Anything from, again, the most important thing for a refugee family is to get stably employed and to get housing. Those are the first 2 things you need when offering to host a refugee family. Make sure that you have a place where they can sleep, and make sure that they have money or income to be able to pay for that place where they sleep. Anyone who's interested in becoming a refugee resettlement church can go over this stuff in more detail, what local resources you have. Like I said, not all refugee offices have the same stuff. Like maybe your local refugee office that you're working with has an ESL program. Maybe they don't. Maybe your local refugee office has, financial training or job training. Maybe they don't. Partnering with those local refugee offices and seeing where the gaps are might be really helpful for the refugee office. We have a group of churches that actually is helping a refugee office by creating an ESL program for them that we at UCC National are helping co-fund, because that's an important thing that the church is offering that refugee office. So knowing which one of these things that refugees need and whether your local refugee office, if you're working with one, could use the help in getting that stuff, that's a really vital thing. We have another group of churches that had a lot of doctors in it, and they wanted to help with healthcare orientation, because as we all know, the American healthcare system is very contrived and difficult to navigate. So these are all just helpful things. Just think of things that you might need when you move to America and what they might not know, and then working to make those things clarified for the refugee family, it's vitally helpful. But basically all the refugee office really needs done is the housing, access to the social services resources, and a job. So I threw in some of this stuff in here about if you do decide to work with any migrant family, about what they've been through. And again, this is the 3-part process that only refugees go through. Asylum seekers only have a 2-part process of being in the country of origin and then going into a secondary country. But refugees have a 3-part process. And we were told by experts when I was working at a refugee office that resettlement is often actually the hardest part. The shock of coming into a new country, not knowing the culture, not knowing the language, feeling isolated and alone, not having processed all the trauma that they've been through beforehand. These are important things to keep in mind when working with a refugee family. One of our speakers for the trauma series that we did over the spring highlighted the fact that many refugee cultures will not even tell you that they are emotionally damaged or that they've been through difficult things, because it's just not part of their culture to talk about mental health. Instead, what they'll do is talk about chronic pain. So if you host a refugee family, and it's more than likely that at least one person in that family will be complaining of chronic pain that may be related to PTSD, post-traumatic stress, and as a way of communicating it, for example. So if you do decide to host a refugee family, please take the time to review our video series on trauma-informed care. Church World Service also hosts trauma workshops for people working with families, because a lot of the behavior that you're going to see with any family of forced migration, whether it's asylum seekers, humanitarian parole, refugee, or other, are going to have lots of trauma in their background. This is more on trauma-informed care. Basically, the bottom line is having good boundaries, knowing where you stop and the refugee family starts, knowing what you can offer and cannot offer, and empowering them to have their autonomy over their own lives. That's the basics of trauma-informed care. But again, we have more information on this in our trauma series if you do decide to host a family. Also, having cultural humility, being willing to learn and grow is essential to being a trauma-informed church. Knowing that you're not just giving to them, but that if you host a family, one of the best benefits is they will provide you with a whole new world. You may very well fall in love with the family that you're hosting and learn lots of things about yourself, your church, and your culture. This is my daughter, Aisha. She's here. The proposed action model, you don't have to read through all that, but basically it says partner with other churches. Hosting any immigrant family is going to involve a lot of your time, your emotional care, financial support, and having multiple churches working together and combining resources is always a huge benefit for sustainability and avoiding burnout. Most of the churches that are hosting refugees right now are either large churches or ones that have banded together to combine resources. And also you can use us at UCC National. So that brings me to my final point, is what can we offer you while you are discerning your call to be able to do this? And that is that we do provide all these videos on things like trauma care, types of migration, why they happen, cultural resources. And we also offer grants, both for helping the initial resettlement, for example, paying rent for a couple months or finding furniture. And then we also have another grant for empowerment that can help you partner with the refugee office to provide English training or job training, or help the refugee family get a car after they have stably found a job, things like that. So we have one grant that's for resettlement and one that's for empowerment. Also connections to your local partnerships, how to work with your refugee office, other churches in your area that may be interested, or not just churches, but also interfaith. If there's mosques or synagogues, I don't usually recommend partnering with mosques just because they are overwhelmed with the amount of refugee needs, but instead using the mosque as a resource or asking the mosque what they need, because it's likely that the mosque themselves in your area is already hosting 10 to 15 families. And that's it for that. Like I said, it's less information than last week, but my hope is that it's targeted information specifically about refugee populations. And this is an excellent way to start hosting migrant families should you determine that this is a calling of your church. So I'm going to go ahead and mute and go close my daughter's door, and I'll be right back, and then I'll open it up for questions. Okay, I'm back. So any questions or concerns that you guys have?
Given the refugees that we are working with, I could use the trauma-informed care information. How do I access that?
Not very good at unmuting myself today, am I? I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so we have a multimedia page. Let me go ahead and drop it. The multimedia page has all the resources that we offer in terms of that kind of stuff. And you go into the search bar and you type what you're looking for, and it'll pull up. So let me go ahead and drop that in the chat.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you say, so I'm going to be sponsoring through the Uniting for Ukraine program of 5 adults from Ukraine that are arriving July 31st. And we're not presently affiliated with, well, we're going to have a meeting with Lutheran Family Services, but we're not really officially affiliated with any big organization. It sounds like the sponsor circles so could you say a little more about training on the sponsor circles?
Unfortunately, I can't, and I apologize. We only have one church in the UCC that I'm aware of that has done the Sponsor Circle program. It's so fresh and brand new that I have not personally worked with it. I could drop the link for the website, and you could peruse it for yourself
Okay.
if you want to. Sorry about
Okay.
that. I don't have better information.
Is that a Fort Collins group that's doing the sponsor circles that you know of? Okay.
No, our group in Fort Collins is working with LIRS, I think.
Okay.
Which is a local refugee office.
Right.
I have a really stupid question. How do you look up a refugee office? Do you start with hhs.gov, or how do you, from my small town, I'm just not sure how you would find a refugee office.
That's not a dumb question at all. I should have put that in there. Sorry, sometimes this stuff I know and I don't know that, it's so much information. So no, that's not a dumb question. So let me drop that link too, and I'll drop all these in an email afterwards for folks that are watching this not live afterward. But basically you go to the Office of Refugee Resettlement website, and they have a map on there that I'm about to drop. In the map, you just click on your state, and it will show you all the refugee offices in your state, and you just pick the one that's closest to you and call them. So I'm going to drop that too.
I probably asked this because I'm not far from the Yellow Pages generation.
Okay, and then Nancy asked in the chat, are we going to talk about freeing detained asylum seekers? Yes, week 4. Week 4 is everything asylum seekers. That would probably be, I probably might have to make that one especially long, because there's a lot of different things that go into asylum seeker programs and different ways that you could help. So yes, we'll cover that in week 4, which is July 27th. So Molly, have you met the family yet, or they haven't yet arrived? You have a family already?
One of them is a former high school exchange student that we had.
Hmm.
And then we haven't met the rest of them, but they're all relatives. Yeah, so we know Anya and we've been talking to her every week.
That's awesome. Do you know what kind of visa they're on? Are they on a refugee visa, or are they on asylum or humanitarian parole?
It's parole. That's what the Uniting for Ukraine, it's on the Uniting for Ukraine program, and I think they're all called parolees.
Right. So we're going to go over parole next week, and then I'll probably talk more about Ukraine, because the Ukrainians that we do see in the United States right now are almost overwhelmingly humanitarian parole,
Right.
instead of refugees.
Can I ask one more question? We're not directly affiliated with the UCC. I mean, I attend, but I haven't actually joined. And we don't have them as part of our circle yet, but are the grants from like your national available for, people like us, or do we need to be really officially associated with a church in town kind of thing? Or do you know how that works?
Yeah, unfortunately, no. In order to qualify for a grant, it has to come from a designated UCC church. They can be in partnership with whoever, but the grant request has to come from a UCC church. However, the empowerment grant, I adapted that from a federal grant called Match Grant. And so you can look up on the Office of Refugee Resettlement website grants for sponsor circles, probably.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question.
Yeah, Mary, go ahead.
Last week, you said there was some confusion over whether asylum seekers, when they apply for asylum, if they would get like a green card. And I think, Karen, you asked this question of Mary Flynn over at the Lutheran Social Services here in Milwaukee. So she kind of got an answer. She said, well, I'm not a lawyer, but they think that applying for asylum for Afghans is being fast tracked. And they think that they're going to get they're trying to do it within 180 days, which was news to us.
That's great. Thanks, Mary. I actually learned a little bit about that too. Is that
right? And that asylum and refugees were kind of equivalent in that, you go directly to a green card. That would be the next step, either from asylum, once that's determined, or refugee status. It would be a green card would be next. And then traditionally, like other refugees, other people in the United States, like Central Americans, were taking like 3 years to process, which is an incredibly long period of time. So anyway, that's the feedback we got.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks for bringing that back up to Karen's question. I also did some of my own research because it was a very good question, and we're going to cover it more next week. But yeah, so basically Afghan nationals have 2 options, and that's to convert to asylum that will eventually convert to a green card, which, as you said, normally takes years and years and years, but it's being fast tracked for Afghans. Or they can convert to SIV, which means special immigrant visa, which means that they worked for the US government and get special status for having worked for the US government. That is harder to obtain because they really have to prove that. But those are basically the 2 ways, is that either they apply for asylum or they apply for special immigrant visa. Okay, well, that was our overview of refugee resettlement, and I hope that it encourages some discernment in your churches about whether or not that is a good capacity and calling for your church. And again, next week, we're going to cover humanitarian parole, which the Ukrainians that are coming over currently, this won't always be the case, the Ukrainians coming over currently are probably overwhelmingly on humanitarian parole. And the Afghans that all came over last year are all almost all on humanitarian parole. So we have a crazy amount of humanitarian parole in the United States right now, which is probably why the refugee cap has not been met, because it kind of has in humanitarian parole. So it may be that the Biden administration is seeing how much of those they can translate into refugees. But we'll go over more about what that means next week. And then again, the final week will be on asylum. I may extend that one to an hour and a half just because there's so many different ways to assist with asylum. Also, I forgot to mention that if you don't want to host a family directly, because that seems too much, there's other things you can do in terms of volunteering and donations to work with other churches, to work with your local refugee office. For example, you don't want to host a family, but maybe you do want to go teach ESL at your local refugee office. That's a perfectly fine way to work with refugees too. And I always encourage doing that if your church does not have capacity to actually host a family. So that's all for this week. And thank you for joining us. And I'll see you again next Wednesday for humanitarian parole.